Well, we're continuing in this series called Cruciformity, and we are looking at a cross-shaped life. We're looking at what it means to be a cross-formed person. And I just want to say, this has been a very challenging series. I know like some people have complained to me a little bit like, hey man, this is tough stuff in kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of way. And my response is, yeah, I know. Imagine having to preach this every week. I find myself week after week like preparing messages and then like looking at what we're going to talk about and saying to myself, I don't want to have to preach this because I don't want to have to live this. Because some of the stuff we're talking about in this series is so countercultural and it's so different from the way we're wired to grow up in this country, the way we think we should do our lives, that it really does call us into a place of making some changes, making some shifts. And there's no exception with what we're going to look at today. Certainly some differences about how we understand our life around us. If you haven't been here for this series, what we've been talking about is how we begin to live a cross-shaped life, literally looking at the cross as a symbol for, or a practice, a way for how we live our lives, a cruciformed life. This messes with things in our life because first of all, it changes our identity. When we begin to understand who we are in the gospel, when we sing songs like the song we just sang, there's something that's happening inside of us that changes how we understand ourselves, how we view ourselves. Then secondarily, we begin to relate to God very differently. And so that's where this cross formation begins to take place. We relate to God differently, and then we begin to relate to others differently because of what's happening inside of us, because of how we understand God. Now we begin to live with the world differently. And we've been talking primarily about how we live with people in general. This morning, I want to shift and begin to talk about how we live together and the importance of living together in what's called the Cruciformed community. It's one thing to learn how we live towards all people everywhere. It's another thing to talk about what does it look like for us to do life together? What does it look like for us to be a cruciformed community? And I want to just talk about that word community for just a little bit this morning. I want to talk about a few things before we dive into our text. It's going to be an unusually long introduction this morning to our actual text, but I want to talk about the word community because I think there's a misunderstanding about community. In fact, when you ask people, like, tell me about your community, and you hear this, and in fact, I recently am meeting with different people in different cities, and I'll ask about their community, and what I hear time and time again is people begin to talk about the physicality of their community. Oh, like we've got lots of, malls, and we have strip malls and regular malls, and we've got lots of golf courses. You always hear people quoting statistics. We've got this number of golf courses per capita or whatever. We have parks, we have schools, we have this sort of downtown. It looks like this. We have a high percentage of potholes. We're high on the pothole percentage indicator. That's us. That's when we ask about people ask us about our community. It's great, lots of potholes. But we primarily talk about physicality with community. And what's interesting about that is it not only reveals a sort of misunderstanding of what the word community means, but I think it also reveals a philosophy that has been so ingrained in our thinking that it's actually shaping the way we think about the places that we live. The word community, when we talk about the word community, when we look it up, you look it up in the dictionary. Don't do it now, do it later. It rarely has to do with the physicality of the places that we're in. Community has to do with shared experiences, has to do with shared values, has to do with what we have in common with each other. It has to do with the ethos of people living together in a particular sort of way. There's something unseen in the word community that we actually can identify. That's what community really means. What's interesting about this is that we see this very differently because of a philosophy or of an understanding that has leaked into our culture. Public society is shaped by a particular way of thinking today. And the word community has been warped by this. This philosophy that I'm talking about, it has really pervaded all of our culture today. There's this sort of commonality now among all of us, and it's largely defined by two words. The two words are expressive individualism. Expressive individualism is a philosophy that is now sort of ruling our age today. It is the defining pathway that we seem to be all living our life on. It's like when you're driving down I-90 and you fall into one of those ruts that seem to never go away, and your car just sort of naturally goes in a direction whether you want it to or not. That's sort of expressive individualism in our culture today. We fall into this rut, and it's just sort of where life defaults to. And let me just explain. Some of you are asking, okay, so what is expressive individualism? Here's a very good working definition. Expressive individualism individualism is the belief that identity, like my sense of identity, comes through self-expression, through discovery of one's most authentic desires, and being free to be one's authentic self. That's expressive individualism, and it's prevalent everywhere in our culture. This is that sort of, follow your heart, believe in yourself, chase your dreams mentality that is just everywhere in our culture. Movies, music, books, TV, like anything you look at is telling this story. In fact, it's telling this story everywhere, and my guess is most of us in this room don't really have a problem with it. Part of us, I'm sure this morning as I read that definition, you're like, so? So what? What's wrong with this? And we say that because slowly as this has grown, we have become numb to the reality of what this is really doing to us. See, expressive individualism is the baseline for what our culture now says is right or true. So if we want to determine if something is right or good or true, we don't measure it against whether it is right or good or true. We measure it against the standard of expressive individualism. And if it somehow cramps my style, makes me uncomfortable, or does anything to tell me that I'm wrong, well, then it can't be true, it can't be right, and it can't be good, because we live based on expressive individualism. We are the creator of our own identity. We're the creator of our own future. You're free. In fact, I would say even in our culture today, you are obligated to be whoever or whatever makes you feel good no matter what anyone says. And it's why we define community in physical realities, because the community becomes something we consume. So we look at the physical buildings, we look at the things that we would enjoy, we look at the stuff that we would consume, because it's primarily about us getting what we want out of a particular place. It becomes a physical reality rather than a true relational reality. See, in a world of expressive individualism, the center person becomes you. You become the centerpiece. You become the star of the show. Expressive individualism says you are the center of attention. The problem is that when this runs its course, and it really is running its course today, it results in a sort of crisis. There's a theologian named David Wells, and he recently wrote this around the same idea. He said, if the natural logic of Enlightenment thinking is the expressive individualism of our time, then that logic has brought us not freedom, but a painful captivity to ourselves. Did you catch this for a moment? He says it's brought us a painful captivity to ourselves. Well, why does he say this? He says that this sort of crowning of ourselves as the ultimate individual in society, this crowning of the self, has placed everything and everyone now in this one perspective that I am the only thing that matters. When this happens, we soon discover this terrifying reality that if I am at the center of everything, then I'm sort of stuck with myself. That's supposed to be kind of funny. At some point, we realize if all I have is me, if everything is about me, well, then I'm the only thing that matters, and that's a little bit frightening, isn't it? If I'm just left with me, I'm pretty aware of who I am. By the way, this is why so many people are offended today when you question them, when you question their way of life, when you question decisions that they make, because the self has become everything. I am my own ultimate authority. I define reality for myself. So if you question me, or if you disagree with my decisions in life, you don't like something that I'm doing, well, I defend myself out of a sense of defending reality because I have defined my own reality. So if you disagree with me, then I'm going to fight you vehemently. Why? Because I am all I have. And if I'm wrong, well, that's devastating. So the results of this, as it's run its course, by the way, this really began sinking more deeply into our culture about 30 or 35 years ago. It's become this pervading philosophy for us today, but it's had devastating effects on us. For example, there is a research project that happens every year. The Gallup Sharecare Well-Being Index is this very real thing that exists today. It started about a decade or so ago, and it measures how Americans are doing beyond like the usual fiscal economic standards that we use to talk about how people are doing, because we all know that people with money aren't any happier than people without money, right? We know that, right? We watch enough news to know that just because you have money doesn't mean you're happy, right? So they measure. So how do we measure this? So every year, the Gallup organization, they interview a random 160,000 adults in the United States, and they talk to them about their sense of purpose, their social relationships. They do talk about financial security. They talk about their health. They talk about their connectedness to their community. And check out what they said earlier this year about 2017. In their findings, it said, 2017 turned out to be the worst year for well-being on record. The overall index score was even lower than during the financial crisis. And for the first time in the decade that Gallup has done this poll, no state in the country showed a statistically significant increase in well-being. Or how about this recent news release? Depression is now the leading cause of disability across the globe, according to the World Health Organization. Depression is the leading cause of disability. Or this one. An estimated 800,000 people will die by suicide this year. In America, 7 out of 10 of those suicides are white males. Do you think this is telling us something? Telling us something about where we really stand? About how we're really living? So here's the deal. We are smart enough to know that we're broken. So lately, a significant number of studies have been done. People have been diving into this issue, saying, wait a second, there's a crisis, and what's the problem? And so they've been looking back in the past, they've been looking at the present, they've been doing all sorts of surveys, and there's a great number of sociologists and psychologists in our culture right now that are identifying the root causes of unhappiness. Why are people so unhappy? What's causing all of this thing? Why is this taking place? And if you look at all the research, basically if you start looking, you read all the articles you can, look at all the data, there are certain elements that seem to be present very consistently. Like over and over again, you see certain data points just keep showing up. I just want to give you a few of these. These are the reasons why we're unhappy, why people are unhappy. The number one reason over and over again, by the way, this has been for like 100 years, but the number one reason that people are unhappy is meaninglessness. Meaninglessness. Like in other words, a lack of purpose outside of ourselves. The number one reason that people are unhappy is they don't have anything driving them outside of themselves. Like there is no sense of meaning greater than just me making my life good. Do you see where this is going? Do you see the irony of this? The number one thing that makes us unhappy is when we focus on ourselves. We need something bigger than ourselves. In fact, Tolstoy said this. He said, joy can only be real if people look upon their life as a service and have a definite object in life outside themselves and their personal happiness. That is old wisdom that needs to be applied today. Amen? So closely related to meaninglessness is the word boredom. Comes up in all the research, boredom. It's different than meaninglessness because that's this sort of larger, like big life thing. Boredom has to do with like right now. Like some of you are bored right now, right? Some of you are like, yeah, this is boring, I know. And so boredom is this momentary meaninglessness, right? It's like in the moment, I don't know what to do. We've told ourselves we need to be entertained. We've told ourselves we need to consume something. We need to be doing something all the time. And so we are completely at unrest when we find ourselves with nothing in front of us. So what do? We fill it. We fill it with Instagram. We take selfies. We get on social media, which is an incredibly addictive behavior because we can't stand to have a moment of boredom. Why? Because at that moment, we're realizing we're left with just ourselves, right? Another one is fear of failure. This is a really interesting one. The fear of failure is essentially this, that we are unhappy because we're worried that our pursuit of happiness isn't going to make us happy. This is a very true, like psychologically, people are unhappy because they're living a particular way and they're concerned that the way they're living isn't going to lead where they want it to lead. So I'm unhappy pursuing happiness in the moment because I'm not sure my pursuit is going to work. Guys, this is real stuff. This is how we're living. This is true. The next one is envy or jealousy. We don't have enough. We want what everyone else has. That makes us unhappy. And then finally, one of the interesting ones that comes up a lot in the research is the lack, this is from people that are polled that are a little later in life, the lack of real personal transformation. That I don't really change, that I'm the same person that I've always been, and I've never gotten over certain things. I've never become different, become better. These are the things. So let me just back up for a moment. Let's think about this. We have a predominant way of approaching life, expressive individualism, in our culture today. We say that's how we're going to find joy. We put ourself at the center, and yet the very cause of our unhappiness that is globally epidemic levels today is meaninglessness, boredom, a fear of failure, jealousy and envy, and a lack of personal change. Is it possible that there's a problem with the rut that we're falling in, the philosophy that we're following, and the direction that it's actually leading? You can see this cycle, right? I want to be happy, so what do? I just double down on expressive individualism. It didn't make me happy the first time, so I'll go twice as hard this time into the exact same thing and expect different results. The great philosopher Willie Nelson said this. He said, "We create our own unhappiness. The purpose of suffering is to help us understand we're the ones who cause it." That's incredibly wise from Willie Nelson, amen? Some of you just amened Willie Nelson. Thank you for that. That's making my day today, right? So there's some truth in this, right? We create our own unhappiness. There's also some truth in the contrast to the individualism that is pervading our culture today. There's a truth in the contrast to this philosophy. There's a truth found in a different understanding of what it means to be a community. And so this morning, I know this has taken a while to get here, but if you have your Bible, I want you to open it up to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. We're going to look at this letter that the Apostle Peter wrote, not to one church, not to one group of people, but to lots of people who were followers of Jesus. And I just want you to hear his words, because what Peter is describing is something that I think responds to this problem of the age that we're in today. This problem that has even leaked into many of our thinking and how we approach the church and our own faith. He says some things that I think address the deep-seated issues at the heart of our unhappiness and actually form us into something that is very beautiful. So listen to what he says in verse 1. It says, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia." I just want to pause here for just a second. Peter's writing to these people and he calls them, "You are exiles." I'm writing to the exiles. Now, in our language, we might understand this as refugees. You are people who are living in all of these different places, and yet your citizenship might not be in the place that you live. But the interesting thing about exiles and why it's different than refugees is that these people might have been born and raised in the city, the country that they're in. They might actually possess citizenship in the places that they live, Pontus and Galatia and Bithynia and Cappadocia. They might possess citizenship, and yet he calls them exiles. He calls them exiles. A group of people who are scattered throughout the world, who are called to live according to a different set of purposes or standards. But this isn't Israel. This isn't even Jewish Christians. This group of people are people who are just a lot like us. People who in the middle of living life, in the middle of this great country, suddenly discovered this person named Jesus and started believing what he said and started choosing to follow his ways. That's who these people are. But he's making something very clear to them. See, God's purpose in history is to tell people who he is, to express his love and his grace, and God does that consistently through a group of people. Now, in the Old Testament, we read about that group of people being Israel. But then we see something happening in the New Testament, and it's the church that now becomes this group of people. And what's also fascinating is that it doesn't end there. It doesn't end with the first church. It continues on. In fact, turn over to chapter 2 and listen to what Peter says as he expands on this idea in verse 9 of 1 Peter chapter 2. He says this, "But you, the same group of people, exiles, scattered in all these places with a different purpose, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light." So he says, you are a chosen people. He doesn't say they. He's not talking about another group and saying, they're chosen. No, you are chosen. He's looking at you and I. And he's saying you, no matter where you live, what your nationality is, you are a chosen person. And he continues, and he says, you're a royal priesthood. Now, this is really interesting, because you have to think for a moment, what does a priest do? What did a priest do then? What do priests do today when you think about a priest? Well, priests are mediators, right? They come between God and man. Priests, they talk with God. They talk to people about God. They bring people to God, right? They are mediators. Priests bring the needs of people to God, right? Priests function in that culture, they functioned very primarily as counselors. They met needs. They even met physical needs. And in fact, in Jewish culture, priests functioned as physicians of sort. In other words, priests are deeply involved in the lives of other people. And look what Peter says. You're all priests. You're all priests. You're a priest. All of you are priests. All of you are doing these things. We are all supposed to be pouring ourselves in involvement and service to the people who are around us. Then he continues, he says, you're a holy nation. In fact, this is an interesting word, the word hagios. We hear the word holy. It's the Greek word hagios. When we hear holy in our culture, we think pious, like you're cleaned up. And you do all the right things, you say all the right things, you never say the wrong things, and you always show up at church on time, and you know, like we think about the person that's like really squeaky clean. That's not the meaning of the word hagios. The meaning of the word hagios is just simply distinct or set apart, like different. You have a different purpose. So he says, you're a hagios nation, you're a set apart nation, you're a different nation. And I love this because Peter is not writing to a particular group of people in a particular country, in a particular city. He's writing a letter that was going to be received by all sorts of nationalities. And so when he says, you are a holy nation, he says, there is this new nation that God is forming. That's kind of like that old nation of Israel, except now it's not bound by borders. Now it's not bound by ethnic background. Now it's not bound by your racial ethnicity, wherever you come from. My new nation is cross-cultural and it is transnational because it is made up of exiles. So you are exiles living in all of these different places, but you're a nation, you're a holy nation who lives under the rule of Jesus, not the government to which you pay taxes. You're a holy nation. Let me ask you a question at this point through this. Does this sound like expressive individualism to you? It doesn't, does it? Listen, as we go on, like what God is saying is that he wants us to be a new society, that the world could see Jesus through us, that there would be something different about us as this exiled new nation. We're to be a community that operates very distinctly and very differently than the principles that are defining the culture around us. Like virtually every aspect of our life, while it might look the same on the surface, is very different as soon as you get beneath the surface. That we might look similar, but we actually are distinct. We are set apart. So we're a holy nation. We are different and distinct from the world and the people around us. And yet at the same time, what he's saying is that we're supposed to be a priesthood, deeply involved. We're different, but we're also engaged and we're involved in the lives of the people of the world. So like Jesus, we are distinct, and at the same time, we are for the world. That's the sort of community that we're created to be. Which means we cannot go through our days just functioning out of expressive individualism and expect to experience the promises of the cross. We can't confine our spirituality to Sunday mornings and waiting to come to this place to experience something spiritual. We are called as a community to respond to the glory of God in absolutely every area of our life as a community of people. And I just want to point this out. Notice this isn't done as individuals. You cannot be a nation by yourself. You notice this? I know some people have tried, but the nation of Brad, you don't call that a nation, right? You can't be a nation by yourself. We are a people. There is a plural form to what Paul is saying. We are a community called to a particular purpose in the world. So we have to understand that the centrality of community is essential to what it means to be a part of this thing called following Jesus. The cruciformed life, community is an essential part of this. We must be a part of it. So what I want to leave you with this morning is three quick things. I want to give you three things. If you're taking notes, you might want to jot these things down, but I rarely do this, but I just want to give you three very objective things to think about as it relates to cruciformed community. First of all is this: you get to know God as a part of cruciformed community. The reason this is important, the reason that this is talked about, the reason we're a nation and the people is plural, is that you actually get to know God in community. Think about Jesus. When Jesus was discipling people, he gathered them together, right? He gathered them in community, and they lived together, and they ate together, and they laughed together, and sometimes they made mistakes together. They had this close contact with each other, and that's where their lives were being formed around Jesus. The most crucial venue for discipleship is not Sunday morning sitting in a seat. The most crucial venue for discipleship is in relationship with other people. That's the best way that the Word of God works into our lives. That's the best way that these truths begin to sink into our hearts. It's the best place for us to change our thinking. So notice this, when God brings a person into a relationship with himself, do you notice that he rarely leaves them out on their own? For all of us in this room, there is something unique in that God connected us with a community of faith. Why is that? Because this matters. Because our gathering, the people that we're with in this journey, is actually important. See, our individualism in our culture has led a lot of us to treat the church like a stadium event. It's like a Mariners game, right? We file in, we get to our seat, which, by the way, a lot of you have your seat. And you get to your seats and you say hi to the few people around us during that super awkward greeting time at the beginning of the service. And once that's over, you're like, okay, back to my thing. And we get a little nugget of truth and we get a little inspiration. And then we go, man, I hope that holds me for the rest of the week. And then we walk out the door. That's not being in community, by the way. That's being a collective crowd. That's not community. We have to cement ourselves in community. The idea is that God is experienced among others, not a place or a time on Sunday. In fact, we've been discovering this recently around here. It's summertime, so I'm going to talk about some behind-the-scenes stuff. But one of the things we've discovered around Summit over the last year and a half or so, and primarily through Alpha, is that some of the greatest stuff that's happening in people's lives is happening around a table where people are sharing a meal together. We've noticed that it's not so much the content as it is the context of where life is being shared. It's the context, it's the relationship, it's the vulnerability, it's the honesty. And so lately, a bunch of us behind the scenes have been asking questions saying, what if we tried things differently? What if discipleship was far more relational and we created more environments like Alpha where people can just sit and get to know each other? And why do we ask those questions? Because of what we see here. So let me just ask you this question. Let me throw this out. Are you with people? Are you regularly connecting with other people? Are you meeting with people to talk about knowing God, to talk about the struggles of your relationship with Jesus, the things you're growing in? Are you asking questions? Do you have people around you where that's happening? Are you learning through Cruciformed community? That's the first thing we need to know about community. The second thing is this, that you change deeply in Cruciformed community. It's interesting that one of the statistics that comes up time and time again is that people are depressed because they're not changing. And yet it's change that happens in gospel community. Our character is shaped by the people who are around us. And that's something that's unique about the Cruciformed community. Think about this. Before you experience the gospel, before you ever experience grace, before you ever know the love of God, everything in your life is about you trying to fill this void that's inside of your own soul. So if you go to work, you don't go to work because you love the work. You go to the work because you need to get something out of the work. It's your identity, right? You work hard because you need something from this to say something about who you are. And so we prove ourselves through our work. The same thing happens in our relationships. Before the gospel, before we experience love and grace, then other relationships, we're not in relationship just to enjoy people, just to love them for who they are. We leverage relationships for ourselves. If I'm not getting what I want out of the relationship, then I'm done with the relationship. And so we leverage those things. But then when we experience the gospel, when we truly have an encounter with the unconditional love of God, when we are washed by his grace, there is something that happens inside of me that now changes how I relate to everything in my life, especially people. And now I can actually enjoy people for who they are, not just how they make me feel. So the gospel changes our relationships. And when we engage in those gospel-shaped relationships, there is change that happens inside of us. Which means if you want the gospel to change you, you have to share life together. You got to talk together. You got to eat together. You got to confess together. You got to talk about your brokenness together. You got to admit, I don't think I got this thing right now. You have to make decisions together, consult other people who are pursuing the same things that you are. Don't just listen to people who agree with you. And until you do, it won't be transforming community. In fact, as we read the New Testament, it's peppered through with all sorts of one another statements that describe a totally different way that we live with other people around us. And truly, these are the definition of a cruciform community. If you want to know what does it look like to be a part of this, we read this throughout the New Testament, that we're to honor one another, that we're to serve one another, that we're to offer hospitality to one another, encourage one another, accept one another, bear with one another, admonish one another, teach one another, and ultimately love one another. That's the sort of community that we're learning to be. So the gospel changes individuals, but only through this deep community. There's something that happens. there's something that happens for me. I stagnate. Just so everybody knows, I am human, just like you. And I go through seasons when I fall into the rut of expressive individualism. And I go through seasons when doing the Lectio Divina is not the easiest thing for me to do at 5 o'clock on a Monday morning. I go through seasons where my relationship with God can get somewhat lifeless. But here's what I find amazing. Sitting over a cup of coffee with a friend, just talking about life and hearing them just wrestle with their faith, hearing them wrestle or talk about things that they're growing in. There is something that happens in a 30-minute conversation with a friend over coffee that will do something inside of me that reignites my passion for God. Why? Because this is how God intended it to be. We grow, we change in the context of community. So do you have places, do you have people you go to that allow those deep things in your heart to be shared and talked about? Are you changing? Are you listening to other people who might disagree with you? Are you opening yourself to be challenged by people? The third thing and the final thing is this, that we win the world through cruciformed community. And this is kind of an interesting one. You say, well, why is community so important? See, the gospel allows community to happen at a very beautiful level, but that community that happens also proclaims the gospel. Community is a part of the good news. It's sort of the announcement of what God can actually do. Some of you, I'm going to bring up some bad memories for just a second. Some of you remember those days like in high school when there was always a group of people that were having more fun than you, right? How many of you kind of feel that way about life right now? Right? There's always someone else that's having a little more fun. And whenever you see a group of people having a little more fun than you, like unless you're really jaded, because there are really jaded people that just don't want anyone to have fun. Usually, if there's those of us that just, we see it, we go, you know what, I want to be a part of that, right? You see other people that are enjoying life, they're moving through, and you go, man, I would love to experience what they're experiencing. There's something compelling about looking at a group of people who are doing life in a particular sort of way. That's what the gospel does with us. The gospel creates a community that is compelling and it's attractive and it's beautiful and it's diverse. And there are other people who look and go, man, I want whatever you guys have there. Like, I want to be a part of this. When the world sees the exceptional community that we can become, there's something that they go, man, in all of my empty efforts and all the things I'm chasing, all the doubling down that I'm doing and all these things that aren't working, this actually might be the thing that gives me hope. So the gospel brings us together. In fact, one of the beautiful things about the gospel is it brings us together in ways that nothing else does. So I want you to do something just as awkward as that greeting time at the beginning of the service. I want you to do something right now for me. I want you to look around the room and look at all the different people in the room. Look around real quick. Just kind of look around at everybody. Crane your neck. Now, what you see is what I get to see every week. And do you know what I see every week? A group of people who would never get together in one place except for the gospel, right? Like you look around, some of you saw people that you didn't even know they went to church here. You're just like, oh, you go to church? Wow, wow. Are you listening to what Brad's saying? But every week I look out and I think, one of the most beautiful things about this is I look out and I just see all of us in this room together, and I go, the only explanation for this is the gospel. You realize that? The only explanation for this is there's something that God does that makes us get in a room like this, and we are so different. We have so many different stories and ages and histories and all this stuff, and that tells a story in itself. It tells a world that cannot unite around anything, that there is unity that can be found. In fact, Jesus said something really interesting. In John chapter 17, verse 23, he said this. He said, may they be brought to complete unity to let the world know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. I mean, Jesus is simply saying, the way the world will know that I'm legit is by this. This tells a story about the legitimacy of Jesus and his message. Amen? So we need this community. And I just want to encourage you with this morning. I want to make something really clear. Expressive individualism doesn't work. Can we agree on that? And the gospel tells us that there's a different way to live in community with others. There's a way to engage life apart from ourselves, a meaning that is bigger than ourselves, a life that is serving others, a life that tells a story to the world around us. And that's what it means to be Cruciformed community. So anytime you hear us talk about stuff that's going on outside of a Sunday, please know that our heart is always that somehow, somewhere, through something that's happening, you would be experiencing true, genuine Cruciformed community. Will you stand with me? This benediction's a kind of a big one for me this morning, and I hope it is for you as well. May you fight the temptation to go it alone. May you resist the gravitational pull that says that this life is all about you. May you experience honest, transparent, real, cruciformed community. Amen. Love you guys so much. Do me a favor this morning. Would you just take a couple extra minutes and linger today? Have a little longer conversation. Don't get out of here like it's a Mariners game. So I would stand by the door, but I got another service to go preach at. I would lock you in if I could, but just hang out, and we'll see you guys next Sunday. See you later.